Hello, everyone, and welcome to the course of world history. I am your host, Mr. Samuelson, and today it's the end of World War I, and we're going to look at how World War I came to an end and how the ending of this war changed the map of Europe and the Middle East. So let's start by talking about the first year of the war. Now, 1917, not the last year of the war, had been a really bad year for the Allies. Millions had died in these failed offensives, and the Russian Empire had withdrawn from the war. Things did not look good for the Allies. Going into 1918, the tide of war had shifted and really was decisively favoring the Central Powers. But the Allies and Central Powers knew that the United States had entered the war, and pretty soon they would be arriving in Europe. If Germany wanted to win this thing, they needed to act quickly. So in March of 1918, Germany gathers all of their Eastern armies, right? They're rushes out of the war. They don't need their Eastern armies on the East anymore. They combine them with their Western armies, and they throw a massive attack at the Western Front. And the plan here is to capture Paris, knock France out of the war before the American troops could join the Allies. But they were just a little too slow. 140,000 American troops were rushed to France and joined the French and British at the Second Battle of the Marne and throws the German Empire back. It's not just that the 140,000 Americans arrived and that tipped the balance, but these were fresh troops, well supplied, well fed. Whereas everybody else was exhausted, the Americans were fresh. And we see that by August, there are 1 million fresh, well-supplied, enthusiastic American soldiers joining the Allied powers in France. This proves enough to tip the scales. Now, it's not that 1 million outnumbered everybody else. France and Germany had more than 1 million men each in the battles at this point. But 1 million fresh, well-supplied soldiers does tip the balance of the war. The Germans at this point are exhausted. They just failed at the Second Battle of the Marne. They know that they can't win, and so they ask for peace. But the Allies, they refuse. Nah, we're winning right now. You don't get peace right now unless you get rid of your Kaiser. We don't want any German empire anymore. You need a new reformed government. We'll talk to that. Well, on November 9th, the Kaiser does resign. He gives into the internal pressure, realizes that he cannot maintain power. He resigns and goes into exile, leaves Germany, goes off to the Netherlands. And on November 11th, the new government is able to sign an armistice, a ceasefire with the Allied powers, which ends the fighting of World War I. We haven't reached peace yet, but there will be no more battles. Now, as Germany is doing this, they face an internal revolution. The end of the war triggers this attempt at a communist revolution in Germany. Just as it had happened in Russia when the Tsar stepped down, the Kaiser stepping down leads to this attempted communist revolution in Germany. The revolution, however, gets crushed. The Germans do not support the idea of communism nearly so much as the Russians had supported communism. And after it was crushed, we get this lingering fear of communism in Germany that will impact World War II. Now, the end of the war also causes a revolution in Austria-Hungary. The thing is, in Austria-Hungary, this multinational nation, there were these groups that had always been suppressed by the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, but the empire itself cannot suppress them anymore. And the empire begins to tear itself apart. Just to show you what this looks like and highlight it, here's the territory of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. And we can see over on this side, Austria and Hungary will remain, but as separate nations. And all these other nations are either created or expanded out of the ethnic groups that had been controlled by their empire. All right, peace settlements. January 1919, the Allied powers meet in Paris. And in Paris, they're going to determine what the final peace settlement of the war will be. Now, during the 4 years of fighting, the goals of the war had largely shifted away from gaining territory. Early on, fight a war, gain some territory, realize that you might have to fight another war down the line, but to get that territory back or to defend that territory, and that's just what war is about. But this man right here, Woodrow Wilson, has a more idealistic view for creating a new world, one where you're not going to fight these types of wars for territorial gain. And he is going to show up to the peace conference and try to shape this new world order. So Wilson's proposal. Wilson's proposal is outlined as the 14 points, which he believed would lead to a more peaceful world. In his 14 points, he portrays the war as a fight against authoritarianism and militarism, the idea that military leaders should control governments, or the idea that we should have absolute rulers. He's fighting for democracy. Now, he also argues for smaller armies, free trade, and for gentle treatment of the vanquished powers. He doesn't want to see them punished harshly in a way that might have them seeking revenge at a later time. Some good foresight there by him. He also sought to create, in his 14th point, an association of nations, which comes to be known as the League of Nations. And the purpose of the League of Nations would be to avoid major conflicts like this in the future by resolving these disputes peacefully. So we go into the Paris Peace Conference with those 14 points. But the Allies disagree with Wilson over these terms. The League of Nations gets approved, and that was Wilson's most important point, but he had to compromise on other issues. Now, I'll add here, sadly, that the League of Nations, while it gets supported by everybody else, when Wilson tries to sell the idea of the League of Nations at home in the United States, the Senate, rejects it. So he fights so hard and makes compromises to get every other nation to agree to the League of Nations, and the League of Nations does not get accepted by the United States. The United States never joins it. All right, in the end, the Central Powers do get treated harshly. France, in particular, wants revenge. They want Germany hit hard at the end of the war. So Britain and France really do dictate much of the terms of the peace treaty once Wilson has made concessions and gotten his League of Nations. And at this peace conference, Germany, they're not even invited to attend. They get no say on what the peace is going to look like. So we wind up with 5 different treaties that come out. 5 treaties with each of the different Central Powers. But the most important of these, because it ripples through history, is the Treaty of Versailles, the treaty between the Allies and the German nation. Germany, according to this treaty, has to admit guilt for the war. They have to say the war was our fault. They have to pay damages to the Allied powers. They have to spend money to rebuild France. They have to agree to reduce its army to 100,000 standing soldiers, a teeny army in Europe. And they have to give over huge swaths of territory to France and to a new Polish state. Poland as a nation has kind of risen and fallen throughout history. At times, Poland has been strong. At times, Poland has been non-existent, squeezed between Germany and Russia into non-existence. At this point, they do have to give up land to recreate Poland. The harsh terms greatly anger the German people. It's literally seen in Germany as terms delivered at the point of a sword. And the German soldiers who had fought this war and not lost, Germany, again, was never invaded, see this as a betrayal, as the politicians stabbing them in the back. That the war was not lost by the army. They were not defeated by the Allies. They were defeated by their own government. So what's the legacy of the war? The end of the war results in the creation or renewal of new nations of Finland, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Yugoslavia are all created at the end of World War I. Practical concerns meant that these borders did not always follow ethnic lines, and this is going to cause later problems. It will cause, actually, future instances of ethnic cleansing and genocide in Yugoslavia because of these poorly drawn lines. The Ottoman Empire is also dismembered, and it's carved up into mandates, which are going to be controlled by the French and British. So we already highlighted kind of how Europe changes. Let's take a look at the Middle East. These are largely territories that were controlled by the Ottomans. And following the war, Turkey, which is kind of the Ottoman homeland, becomes this independent republic. Republic meaning elected government. So this is now the remnants of the Ottoman Empire, or the most closely tied descendant of the Ottoman Empire. Syria becomes a French mandate. Mesopotamia, Iraq, becomes a British mandate, as does Palestine. Now, mandate simply means that they're overseeing the country. They didn't want to use the word colonized because Wilson had really been opposed to the idea of anybody colonizing more of the world out of this. But the mandate does give these governments some authority over those nations and the rebuilding of those nations, with the idea that they're going to shepherd the nation into a more responsible independence in the future. Sometimes that happens, sometimes it doesn't. Saudi Arabia becomes independent. Persia, Iran, this territory also gets affirmed in its independence. It was not a part of the Ottoman Empire. All right, impact of total war. The total war of Europe of World War I devastated Europe, and it left many distrustful of progressive reforms, including free speech and free press. Many within the governments had disliked these, seeing that its nationalist inclinations could rip apart a nation internally. So governments are slow to return these rights to the people, free speech and free press, particularly in the more authoritarian areas of the world. And this was, again, largely because of fear of internal minorities. Continued economic and political instability in Europe throughout the 1920s into the 1930s really does shatter the hopes that Europe might return to a new normal. And by the time we get into the 1930s, we see that Europe is very far from normal. As one World War I soldier, a certain Corporal Adolf Hitler, starts talking in Germany about the need for national pride and the distrust of international organizations. That we'll get into in a future lesson, but that is all for today. I hope you enjoyed this lesson and that you learned something, and I'll see you next time. Farewell.